at a website that is called info@rewildingglobal.org. So those of you who are interested, please do visit Rewilding the Global Alliance, because it's a great set of, it's a consortium of scientists, of restoration practitioners, and of conservationists and people who are interested in restoring nature. I also want to just mention one fact that came to my notice today, and maybe I'm just a late bloomer and should have known this earlier, but somebody was telling me today that the Andaman Islands are slated to become a global port, basically a freight handling place, that the forests are going to get chopped down, and that the compensation for the forests being chopped down in the Andamans, the compensatory forestry, is going to take place in Madhya Pradesh. I have never heard anything so stupid in my life. But I just want to mention this. We can come back to this perhaps later at the end of the talk. But now I want to introduce my friend Supi, who is an inspirational leader of a wonderful community that lives and operates in the hills of Wayanad. I've known Supi for many years and admired her for many years, and had some absolutely wonderful trips to, to the Gurukula uh, sanctuary where she lives and works. But I'm not going to say more than that. I'm going to leave it to her to tell us who she is, who they are, and the kind of work they do. So over to you, Supi, and thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you, Pradeep, for organizing this, and ISOLA for getting us all together. Just before I begin the presentation, I want to say a couple of things. One is that I'm not a gardener, so I have gleaned from my many friends and collaborators and colleagues in this landscape and elsewhere. I live among gardeners and envy their extraordinary abilities. But my own role has been maybe as a naturalist of gardeners, you know, that I study them, or that I try to understand what it is that they are doing, why it is they do what they do, and try to remove my own lenses and judgments of what is good or bad, because it is just so intriguing what they do, how they do what they do, and how a pretty barren place that it had been deforested in this area in Wayanad over 50 years has had all these mad proliferations happening in, you know, this little corner and that little corner, and the land itself with its own extraordinary capacity to come back to life, different creatures jostling with each other, and you know how this intermingling happens over 5 decades. I've been here for about 28 years, so I have the stories from before, and it's a completely fascinating journey. And the other thing that I want to say is that I had, before I came here, I had had 2 stints in other places. My own education actually was in 3 of the Krishnamurti Foundation schools, a bit like Vasant. And way before other people did this sort of thing, they had already begun the process of reviving the lands in Andhra Pradesh, in Karnataka, in England, southern England. And everywhere there was this question of what is right for the land, how can human beings live there, how do we bring the wild animals back, who belongs here, who wishes to live here, and the extraordinary diversity of plants and animals. So in all these landscapes, I had from a very young age the possibility to witness this revival. And then I did a 2-year project in England when I was there at the Krishnamurti Foundation School, of the ecological history of a landscape garden and park, which had this whole historic side to it, you know, this how it became a farmland, an arable farmland from this Flint Hill chalk downs, and then how each owner actually, you know, imposed or encouraged or brought about their own vision, and it meant its own set of species whenever they did their gardening. So it went from chalk downs to a farmland to this landscape park with big cedars of Lebanon. And then later on, there were people who looked at wildflower gardening. And then the people who were there at the Krishnamurti Foundation, they wanted to bring as much possible of the native oak woodland flowers and so on. So there's been a long history for me of looking at how the land comes back to life, and also to how gardeners work. I spent a year at the Land Institute in Kansas before I came to Gurukula in 1993, where they were looking at the problem of the prairies. And the primary problem of the entire middle west of America is, of course, the Dust Bowl and the fact that it's a large monoculture, either of wheat or of corn. And the prairies, meanwhile, are perennial polycultures. So they are these deep-rooted grasses, but then it's not all grasses, it's also grasses and composites and legumes. So we spent, they've been at it for a long time, but I spent a whole year looking at the prairie, at the tall grass prairie, and how an agroecological system could mimic the prairie. So that was a bit of a background to coming here. And when I came with a bunch of friends to visit this place, I found a bunch of people here, Wolfgang Toyakov, who started the place, and Lali Joseph, who is still here, and Wolfgang passed away. And I found here were a whole bunch of people who were trying to mimic different habitats of the rainforest of this region, but they were working with tiny, tiny plants, and they were working with soft plants, and they were climbing trees. And there was this whole question of the fact that the rainforest consists of so many different plants, not only trees, which are very, very important, not only woody lianas, but mosses and ferns and various kinds of mosses. You have the bryophytes, you have the liverworts, you have the hornworts. So I was completely fascinated that without any formal education, a combination of traditional people here and someone who learned on his own, were bringing back some of the mega diversity groups within this area. So it would be the equivalent of, if you looked at animals, if people were working with tigers, but then a whole bunch of people came along who were working with dragonflies or frogs, and what that entails. So now I'll get into my presentation, but there's been a lifelong fascination with gardeners, and that's all I want to say. I cannot grow a plant myself. I have to see.
Just press the green share screen button at the bottom.
I thought I did that. Just a second.
Have you clicked on share screen?
I think I've got my presentation. Just a second. Okay. All right.
So
can you see it?
We've got half your screen, no?
Oh. All right, and then I have
you look.
Yeah, so now you have to go. You have to
press full screen.
Yeah.
Can you see it now?
Yeah. Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
So Gurukula Botanical Sanctuary has been around since 1971. It began as an ashram in the forest where Wolfgang came and sat doing nothing for many years, and became interested in the plant life quite a bit after he came. so there are many things that have come out of that original life of solitude. But one of the actions that he did was simply to leave the land alone, that the 7 acres that he came to was just left alone. Now, one of the things that I've tried to do is to find the one term that will fit everything that we do. Because we're working, there's a botanic garden here, there's species conservation areas, there are habitats with rehabilitated plants, there is agroforestry and food forests, and there's land which has been left alone, there's community-based community-based ecological nurturance. But the one term that fits us is simply this, which is that of an ark. It's archaic to use this term, and it's a really it's a cliche, but in our instance of ark, we have this extraordinary diversity, some of which is selected, and some of which has just happened on its own, some of which is traditional of the peoples of this land, and some of it is sort of on par with some of the ideas of this time. So we have not selected 2 and 2 of each, but large self-propagating communities of different kinds of plants, which then bring back the animals, which then bring back entire habitats, and then we are living in there with all this. And the whole reason for the ark is simply this, that there was a time when there were many healthy biomes and the planet was somewhat whole, even though it was a changing planet. And then came the whole business of civilization, and over the last 10,000 years has been ecocide of different kinds. What I think we and all refugia around the world are these collapsed small communities of plants and animals and fungi and so on, who have to make it through this time. And we are in this third area, the yellow colored, which is of drawdown and overshoot, massive ecocide, genocide, climate chaos, species extinction, all that, and a kind of an elementalization of these vast organic, grasslands and forests and so on. So this is not the desert that Pradeep is talking about. This is a man-made desert. And right at the end, and we'll talk a little bit about how we see invasives here, is this rapid covering of these extremely barren lands that have been made barren, and the arks have to make it through into post-collapse. So what are we talking about when we talk about ark over here? Is something like 3,000 species of plants, at least, at Gurukula Botanical Sanctuary. We have more than 250 species of birds. There's dozens and dozens of frogs and snakes. There's the sambar that are coming in to browse on all these. So there's a whole sort of, it's a proliferation of different life forms, and they all have to be taken through into this terrible time. Oops. Why is it not moving on? So here's India. Here are the Western Ghats, and the Western Ghats themselves are like an ark. They're surrounded by fairly dry areas to the north and east and south, and then there's the Arabian Sea on the west. And where we are is somewhere there, towards the south. Here is our land, the black dotted line, and to the west, which is to the left, you can see a reserve forest, which parts of it are quite ancient, and I believe that the rainforests are some of the oldest biomes on the planet, that they have sort of sustained through the ice ages, and people say that 100 million years old. So some of the core areas of rainforests around the Earth are very, very old, and they have diversified and migrated and shrunk and expanded and retreated through all the extinctions and the ice ages. So you can see that the Gurukula land itself is a mosaic of different types of, different heights of vegetation and different types of vegetation. Bunch of friends got this map together just to show that we began in this old forest where the Trogon is, with 7 acres that Wolfgang came to. And then we have then added almost every year an acre or 2 acres. And eventually we have come to about 70 acres, all of which, except for the 7 acres, has been clear felled. So different people had these lands and they raised them to coffee and to ginger. They slashed the forest down and had ginger plantations. There was rubber on some of them. But we have seen over 50 years how land comes back to life. And for the greater part, we have actually left most of the land alone, which is, so out of 70 acres, there's maybe about 50 acres that are largely left alone. We operate a little bit as slash and burn groups where we go and we harvest a bit of something that we need. And the garden is slowly, or the various gardens are worked in through these lands. So the view from my window is this mountain, which is 2,000 meters high and has the Shola grassland ecosystem that Vasant talked about. And in the foreground is our land, which you see is a kind of furry cover of trees. And in the mid-ground, you have different plantations, and the valleys are full of different annual monocultures. Just a short walk from this land, you will have nice old growth forests with big trees, lianas, and a sort of a sparse understory. Inside these small streams in these valleys, you have tree ferns and heavy cover of mosses. So this is the muse. You know, this is a scene such as this would be something that we would want to recreate on the land itself. Here's just a synopsis of some of the different activities or programs. To the left, you have a botanic garden, which shows plants from around the world, tropical plants. It's a small area of about 2 acres, and a lot of people, it has a lot of footfall. Thousands of people come in, and they come in to see the different kinds of strategies that plants use to obtain whatever it is that they need to live, to thrive. On the top is a nursery, is part of one part of the garden where you have ferns and impatiens, balsam, also known as balsam. So you can see it's in a shady area. And to the bottom is land that is just growing to whatever it wants to be. Rewilding for us might look like this. It's not a great picture, but they're hard to photograph on a phone. So these are bladderworts, and bladderworts are carnivorous plants, and they're common all over the country. But they're a great feature to have as an example of plants that require insects, and they're also aquatic. To the left is an exotic, a cycad, which in the botanic garden represents the gymnosperms, but covering it are myriad epiphytes, ranging from ferns to impatiens, and this beautiful gesneriad. It's related to the African violets. It's called Rhynchoglossum, and mosses. So that would be an example of rewilding for us, where every surface that is available for these tender, delicate, cool-loving species, they are able to then occupy and self-propagate and form these communities. So here's another muse. It's a little community by a stream, which has lichens and ferns. And these impatiens, I think everybody knows the balsams. The genus is impatiens. So we have in the Western Ghats 100 species of these impatiens. So that is, it's for a genus, it's a lot of diversities, high diversity genus. It would be like if just the tigers, the Panthera family genus was to have 100 different kinds of cats in a forest area. So this particular type of impatiens is called scapigerous, which means it has a leaf and it has no stem. It puts out a stalk and a flower, sort of like primroses. So they don't actually have a stalk around which, a stem around which the leaves are arranged. Very delicate, and they come out during the monsoon. So this would be another muse. And on the rock, you see ferns and also mosses and lichens. The same species by a waterfall further south in the Western Ghats forms a slightly different kind of community, growing on granite. And in the garden, the same species grown by Lali on a rock wall with ferns, different kinds of ferns. There's also other herbs. So this is what we are able to do. This is what the gardeners here are able to do. And very attractive plants, but also precious in a conservation sense. They are highly endemic. The whole group has across the Western Ghats, from the north to the south, you can sort of read the landscape going north to south through the impatiens as they occupy only certain plateaus. They are not widely distributed. But how local is local? If I'm just going to talk about the parts of the land where we are trying to grow plants that are absolutely native to this area. So although we have plants from around the world, although we have conservation species from around the Western Ghats, the topic of this particular talk is really, the plants from this forest. But what do we mean by this forest? Across the stream, we have wet evergreen forest. I can see this Shola grassland from where I am sitting. It's a bit further away. It's about, and it's classic Shola grassland. You have a second order stream down in the valley. You have this outlier peak, which has a beautiful rocky terrains, and then grasslands and Shola, these snug kind of forests that Basan showed you. And just across further east, not far as a crow flies, you have moist deciduous and dry deciduous forests. So how local do we want to be, and what would be right by the land itself? So here is what might happen, that we inherit a piece of land, which to the top left looks like that. It was cut and cleared, and maybe there was ginger or lemongrass. A small homestead was planted in the valley, and then we would buy it, or friends would buy it, or the collective is slowly growing. And over time, what you see is just this left alone land, which has casuarina and pine and lantana, and also native trees. Another view in the same watershed. These were the slopes that we bought. They look like this: ginger plantation, vertical beds pointing downwards, which means that the soil erosion is very high. And you can see that fuzz on the left extreme that was Gurukula in 1997. It sort of ended like that. And then now the same view, a close-up picture, you can see it's very green, and with shrubs and trees also. I tried to put this together for this talk. I'm not very good with this kind of infographic, but if you can see here to the left of the picture, you have something that might be considered native or natural, the type of vegetation with little springs and the river, and then these bamboo breaks, which are called Aucklandra breaks, aquatic vegetation, which is partially submerged, and the riparian forest with trees, different species of trees. There's obviously primary forest, but also much of it is secondary forest. And a lot of the land itself is regenerating with native species. And then whatever's pink is the areas under different kinds of invasives, which in our instance are moving towards some kind of woodland, which is largely of native species. So we also have a food forest, which would, in our area, would look like pepper, jackfruit, mango, banana, mixed with other fruits. We try to grow vegetables, some of which would be tubers native to this area, Dioscorea, and so on. So it's a huge diversity of different kinds of plants, and I'm not including the botanic garden with plants from around the world, carnivorous plants, different kinds of anthuriums and philodendrons and bromeliads and so on. So just a few shots of the different kinds of habitats. The upper right is the Ochlandra bamboo brake by the stream in the dry season, with polenta walking through it, sniffing out the wild boar. And then lower down is our valley field, where we have cultivated an old variety of rice for many years, and it's kind of being abandoned now because the rice is getting too shady for the rice. So there's a question of whether we can actually keep the land race going because this place is getting too shady. We have a neighbor's tea garden on the right of the top picture, and then we have something that when we buy the tea, that's what happens to it if we don't pull it out. The lower picture is actually a tea that is several meters high, and you can start to see the different kinds of the zonation of light. And one thing that we're thinking of doing now is to actually plant at the base of we're going to clear tracks through the tea. Instead of clearing it completely, pulling it out, we're going to use the shade at the bottom and make these tunnels so that we can plant evergreen forest species, deep forest species, and then see if we can skip a step. So instead of taking it out and starting the whole phase with pioneering species and then slowly letting it work its way, we might actually use the shade and the water filtration and that there is some mulch and so on, and then interplant with native forest species like ironwood or Kalinia, which the lion-tailed macaques love, rattan, and so on. The top is a hilltop which had tea, and there the tea was pulled out. I think that particular hill, some 24,000 tea bushes were pulled out by hand. And that's there's a lot of Wendlandia, which is found across the country, different kinds of tussock grass, lemongrass also. And it's quite open. And because it's a steep slope, it's actually taking its own time to attain a canopy. It's also had a fire. And the tea there was pulled out maybe 20 years ago. So it's actually quite slow in some ways. The picture at the bottom is completely, it was lemongrass and nothing was done. And this is self-planted forests with aporosa, apodytes. I'm not sure how familiar any of you are with Latin names, but I don't know the northern names for them, Pradeep. Do you know aporosa and apodytes? But it's self-planted and there's a lot of animal activity. So gardening for us might look like this. We have Sandy on the left on top of a tree more than 5 meters high, planting a variety of ferns in the botanic garden area. Bottom right, you have Lali, who's ferrying a whole bouquet of native ferns from the nursery to a place on the edge of the forest. And on the top, you have the classic conservation conundrum, which is a native monkey who you want to protect, feasting on a planted out orchid, who you also want to protect, on a regrown woodland. And even a single monkey can do a lot of damage to the herbaceous plants. But it's the kind of question that we have to constantly jostle. So there's Lali, and this is in a regrown forest, which has just done it by itself. Lali and Sonia. This is the crew who comes in every day, women from the neighborhood, and they work in the rockery and in the grasslands, in the evergreen forests, in the various parts of the land. They come in at 8 and then they leave at 4. So a lot of skill working with different life forms over 30, 40 years. This is Wolfgang, who began the whole thing, and here he is with Silotum nudum, which is one of the members of the fern, the pteridophytes. So this is another example where people have taught themselves about the life in these forests and learn this very hard skill of protecting them. Because I think Pradeep has mentioned it in the talks that there is no book where we can find out exactly how to grow these plants in these particular conditions. And particularly 20 or 30 years ago, before all this rewilding and the different kinds of conservation activities have become more popular, there was nowhere where we could go for the kind of information that we needed to grow some of these plants. Another view of ecosystem gardening or rainforest gardening. You have to get up trees. You have to know which trees to plant which epiphyte on. You have to monitor them, keep an eye on them over time, see how they spread through the area. Lali's repotting a native fern, and that's a whole exercise. If you've got nurseries, it is very time consuming. It's also just labor intensive, it's expensive, and the pot world, it's more susceptible to diseases, and all that has to be figured out. But it's a necessary part of our program, because if for something happens to the plants outdoors in this changing climate, we still have some of them in the nursery areas. So they've been planted in all these environments that we think they will do well in, and there's always something left within the nurseries. I want to introduce the subject of life forms. Pradeep mentioned this beautiful word, which I'd never heard of, chasmophytes. And we've had with Basant some of the grasses, and we've had trees. So here in the rainforest, or in this type of ecosystem gardening, we have a whole bunch of life forms, which is basically a strategy. It's a way a plant grows, and you have annuals, perennials, you have succulents, and it's the structure of the plant, and it's also what it does to grow well. You have woody climbers, herbaceous climbers, obviously the carnivorous plants, and you have different kinds of carnivorous plants. Locally, we have the
We've lost your voice, Supi. You got muted by mistake. Supi, your mic is muted. Your mic. You have to unmute yourself, sir. It should be at the bottom left of your screen where it says mute.
Okay.
Yeah, there we are.
Yeah.
You go back, please, a little bit.
All right.
Yeah, right there. Slide 28.
I'm not able to get the play button for some reason. Okay. You have trees, obviously, but then we have trees like bananas, and I don't know, Pradeep, are bananas trees, but they attain a height. They are soft. They have no wood. So they are herbaceous in some ways. They are annuals as they are cultivated, but actually they are perennials as they grow in the wild. And there's some perennial bananas in these mountains. You have the gymnosperms, cone-bearing trees, but we also have a cone-bearing liana, which is the netum. You have the scapigerous plants, which I described earlier with the impatiens that I showed you. You have tuberous plants, and giant tubers to tiny tubers like the ceropegias. So I don't want to go through all these, but there's an extraordinary diversity of life forms that the rainforest gardeners here have to contend with, because it's also about the future and where they will do well, what what kind of combinations they can grow in, and so on. So if you're wanting to grow any of these life forms, you have to get to know the structure of the plant, how it roots, where it stores its energy, when it flowers, which is also the phenology. Here are, everybody's familiar with orchids, but here are two native species of orchids. So the one on the left, a Disperis, is a tiny herb with little tubers, and you see it round about now in March. It starts to come up around, which is, it's already there in the forest, but it's also been introduced onto the land. On the right, you have an orchid, which is the size of your thumbnail. And what you're seeing, these little oyster-like things, are the pseudobulbs, and the red flower. It's tiny. If you look at it with a lens, you can see the structure of the orchid flower, classic structure. But because the orchids are such a diverse family, with something like upwards of 30,000 species worldwide, of which a huge number are in the canopy, the challenge is to find the right trees that these can grow and multiply and so on, and just create a habitat. Here are the impatiens, and we have 4 different kinds of habits of impatiens. One is the annual, so a lot of seed collection needs to happen. You have the scapigerous one in the center, and you have the epiphytic one. So across in the shola grasslands that is, as a crow flies, is not far. You have the one on the right, which is on the top right, the red one. Beautiful, succulent, epiphytic impatiens with these jug-like spurs. And then, which means that they grow on trees. And then the lower one is a perennial, and these are large shrubs. So these 4 very different ways of growing for one genus. Begonias, there are many begonias that are native to these forests, and this is a herbaceous one, but there's also cane-like ones and scapigerous ones. These are, again, ground orchids. The family of the African violets, we have a number of endemics. These are tuberous plants, the cobra lilies. On the top, you have Lagenandra, and you have the Arisemas and the Amorphophallus. And so they have to know when to repot these plants, because they have a germination point just before which you have to actually transplant them. And if they're outdoors, they are susceptible to rats and porcupines, which love these tubers. So if you had a nursery with them, you would have 8 months where the plant is actually dormant, and then it puts out its flowering head. And then after the flowering head dies down, the leaves come out. So on the left is a nursery section, and on the right is an outplanted area which has a number of these different plants. So you have the woody vine on which an orchid has been planted amidst moss, and then you have this Anaphyllum, which is the purple lily, which you can see at the back, which is a member of this aroid group. And then you have these various shrubs, and then there's a backdrop of native trees. The strobilanthes, so there's a huge variety of strobilanthes, the family Acanthaceae. Vasant talked about the kurunjis. So we have something like 50 or 60 species of these in the garden, and they form shrubs. And they're very prolific when they grow well. So there obviously has to be a place designed for them. The melastomes, I think, haven't been talked about, and not many people know about them. Absolutely beautiful group. The Osbeckia on the left, which is a perennial, and the Sonorilla on the right, also a perennial, much more delicate, however. And various other groups, the brinjal family, the mint family, the pea family, the commelines, the asclepiads, and so on. So each of these is a particular life form. The ground orchids in the nurseries on the top left is a whole exercise in repotting them, but the same ground orchids on the right in the forest floor, all designed and planted and very deliberate, but to mimic what it might how it might look like in its original habitat. You have, again, the scapigerous impatiens on the left at the top in a rocky habitat where just dry stone walling. And on the right, this is how the epiphytic impatient looks on a tree. So here's just a little short video of the Scapigerus impatiens, a different one. Is the video moving? No. Okay. To the top right is a meadow in the Palni Hills where an impatiens, that's how we see it. And on the left is a meadow at the Gurukula Botanical Sanctuary, the impatiens in grass. This is a picture just to show you how closely linked the ferns are to moisture. And on the right is a whole habitat that's been planted up by gardeners here with a whole mix of different species. The trees were there, but the area was quite degraded. And you have climbing ferns and terrestrial ferns, lace ferns, Commelinaceae. So the sense is that when you're gardening, that plants respond to prevailing conditions, and you have to understand those. And in a place such as this, the numbers of microhabitats, the sheer diversity of microhabitats is immense. But they grow and they create other conditions. And if you know the scheme by which they are happy, then you know that later on you might be able to plant species that you couldn't in the initial phases. So that's an epiphytic habitat planted with different ferns, but also the lycopod, the spiky plant, which is also called the tassel fern. And there's an aroid on the tree. And so this is quite high up. This is maybe 4 meters on a tree, on a persea. And this has all been planted up and has to be looked after for some time before it becomes independent. On the left is a habitat with tree ferns in the wild, and on the right is a habitat with tree ferns in the garden. You can never fool yourself that you can get it exactly like how it is in the wild, but with the conditions and the possibilities that we have and slow observation and great deal of care, tree ferns can grow. So here's an area with which was a quarry. So I put this picture in because Paul talked about abandoned quarries, and this was a quarry for laterite stones where we put in a little pond and some dry stone walling, and primarily for this fern, which is the golden tree fern, which comes from a higher elevation. And it was a delight to watch this place unfold over the years. And right now it's actually in a whole other community that has happened there. Some of the local plants, just to put in some fancy names, but between them you have lycopods, these fern-like plants. You have ground orchids, you have the impatiens, you have this African violet type of plant, you have a tree fern, you have a tree, which is a Kalinia. You have a ground orchid, which is the Acanthophypium bicolor. You have Anaphyllum bedomi, which is an aroid, and you have Aucklandra travancorica, which is a local bamboo, riparian bamboo species. So these are various species that are native to our forest, and we also have them in the rehabilitated or replanted areas. This is actually, Lali just sent it to me just before the talk, and this is a filmy fern, which is found in the local forest. It's quite hard to grow because it really requires very wet conditions. But she has, it's like membranous, and it's on a tree, self-propagating and doing very well in the garden. Broadly speaking, over the years, these are the different kinds of experiments, single individuals or on mounts in greenhouse and nursery conditions, single to several individuals, and also of the same species, but also of different species tried in the greenhouse conditions. Small mixes of species in clusters, just a few square meters, representing clusters we see in the wild. And then these larger habitat, anything from 1/2 an acre to 1 acre to 2 acres. And then this larger area of 7 to 10 acres, which is topographically varied, where you start to see, how the forest comes back. nursery work is incredibly hard work, and hats off to the whole group that has to work with tiny seedlings looking like cabbage or mustard seedlings, and then transplanting them to, when the time is ready, to larger pots, and then again transplanting them, and then when the moment is right to transplant them outside. And you can, the white labels that you see is just to show you that over 30 years of bringing these plants from different places across the Western Ghats, the information has been kept and tracked, and also in the garden where they are planted out. So I would not use the word restoration for much of the species conservation work. I would use the word rehabilitation. And the whole place was designed really as a search and rescue operation for plants that we believe were threatened by mines and dams and roads, and a lot of them come from these very vulnerable areas where something is going to come up, and we just bring them back. Fallen trees, coffee plantations, rubbish dumps in cities, in hill cities, where we found interesting species. So, and all that has been tracked over 30 years. So here is a very simple kind of landscaping using the laterite nodules that we have here. This was a cardamom plantation where the cardamom didn't do too well. It wasn't productive. There were trees, and the terracing was used to plant it up with a mix of native species, featuring largely tree ferns and the elephant ferns, and then there was a whole number of tree ferns, but also some vines. And the rockscapes contain everything from mosses to Didymocarpus, which is this African violet type of plant, and impatiens and so on. The same area, many years later, this is in the monsoon, of course, but you can just see how it fills up. And they arrange themselves. So the sense of something being dense and packed has been actually created by the plants themselves. And of course, people have to go in and weed the areas from exotic herbaceous plants, and there's a few of those. But it's really interesting how these arrangements happen over time. In the same area is rattan, which is a climbing palm, which is a whole other life form. Just to show you this kind of piggyback riding that plants do. On the left, fallen tree fern, which is turned up, and on it is a Didymocarpus plant. And then on the right, a different type of stone, which is very conducive to these impatiens. Here's an abandoned pot on the left, and a mix of Impatiens gardneriana and Rhynchoglossum nortoniana, both endemics. And they just go and find, when they start to self-propagate and find their own place, they're quite robust. And on the right is this strange milieu of heliconias and aroids as well, philodendrons. But then you have a roof that is covered with native epiphytic ferns, and then tree ferns, which have established themselves because the whole microclimate of the area changed. We had sprinklers going for some time, and now the sprinklers are far less in the area, but that changed the whole climate of that area. Obviously, the animals, they come with the plants, or sometimes the plants come with the animals. There's a shield-tailed snake on the left, different kinds of insects. And we have lots of naturalists coming who study these over time. And it's a real pleasure to see these proliferations in the animal world as well. There's a lichen frog on the top right, which is nicely camouflaged with a tree, and a trogon, female trogon on the left. Malabar whistling thrush. Everybody knows this one. The Malabar grey hornbill on a Caryota. And there's massive Caryota populations everywhere. They seem to come back really strongly. Amazing variety of frogs. And interestingly, we've noticed that the bromeliads, which really should not be part of this talk because the bromeliads are all from largely from South America, the tank plants, because they actually contain little tanks of water, even in the dry season, what we've seen is the native frogs, endemic frogs, start to breed within them. The Nilgiri marten in a regrown forest. This is the kind of thing that I enjoy, which is to see how just completely demolished land starts to come back to life. And then you start to see an endemic on the right, which is an annual impatiens. And the forests come back on the bottom picture in the center. So I've done a lot of documentations of how the land changes over time. This is the infamous evil Wedelia, which is a very dense mat forming exotic from the Caribbean, I think. What we've seen is that it does really well in this kind of an environment, but on our land, because there's such a pressure of native species, shrubs come behind it and they use the coolness that it creates and then push it upwards. So after some time, the Wedelia is a foot above the ground or 2 feet above the ground, and you have all these different plants coming from inside, and then they come over it and then shade it out. So my post-industrial landscape will feature a few of these. So the problem with gardening, and we have to always remember, is that it's a double-edged sword, it's a double-edged action. Often you are selecting, you're exclusionary, it's highly subjective. And, you know, how do you choose? How do you select? How do you actually know what was there, right there for that spot? What is right? And all the gardeners I've found do different things. And the great thing is that this terrific diversity happens over time. Usually war is being waged on somebody, whether it's rats or bandicoots or pigs or some happy perennial or annual that is established itself. It's management heavy if herbaceous annuals are involved. So you have to really watch that question of, you know, what kind of plant you're growing, how much weeding you want to do. Do you want to be weeding for the rest of your life? And when you're living in a place like this, actually the thing that we do most is weeding. And the greatest expense of the garden is actually moving through weeding. And it's all cool, but you have to be prepared to be there again and again. For instance, bracken in a grassland at this elevation is actually pushing the mimic, the grassland mimic that we have planted towards a woodland. But if we want a grassland there, because locally there is a grassland, we have to weed out the bracken intensively, year after year after year. So what is nice about ecosystem gardening is that it turns gardening on its head. It uses the tools and techniques of gardening, but it is moving the place towards something that is native and natural. And of course, you're playing God and you are selecting, but you're also going to leave alone and then, you know, champion it towards a point in time whereby plants are doing well on their own. And it's incredibly rich in habitats over here in this landscape. So the kind of binary that we would, you know, advise people or we'd be getting people to look at would be, are you discouraging life? Is that a problem for you, wildlife? You know, sambar deer or elephants, in our case, the elephants have just wandered through, grasshoppers of different kinds. Is fungus a problem? And then how to go from the worst in my mind is annual monoculture. Wherever annual monocultures exist as a form of agriculture, that has to move towards many life forms. So if in our area people are growing bitter gourd as an annual crop, we would want to encourage them towards something else that is a perennial polyculture. So even with farming, you can move it towards a biome that is more diverse. If it's chemical intensive, to organic, annual to perennial, exotic to native. So this is just to give you an example of the kind of advisory role that we would play with other people who want to help the land or rewild or rehabilitate, and all these different terms, and they mean different things to different people. So, you know, the kinds of questions that I would have, and we debate between us, is these dense stands of tea. As far as we can see right now, they're doing something. There's something that they're doing, which is they're sequestering carbon. They're sheltering lots of wildlife, which are a problem for our neighbors because they go from the tea into other people's farms. Jungle cat is there, leopard cat is there. They prevent soil erosion, they provide shade. So should we take them out and then do a grassland, or should we take them out and have a rewilding native forest that plants itself? Should we just leave the tea alone and then interplant underneath it? Those are the kinds of questions we'll have. You have intensely expanding coffee, which is behaving as an invasive, but it supports civet, and civet supports the spread of coffee. And you find that wherever there's this dense coffee growth, it's much cooler and it's rich in fungi. And we did a study with an Irish bryophyte specialist who came and found dozens of epiphytic mosses and liverworts on these coffee stems. So how would you actually remove them? And what are you prioritizing? And one of the things that we would go by is need. So since we cook with firewood, we will harvest from these places and we keep them as a woodlot until we can use them. We use timber, we need mulch, we need stalks for, planting other plants such as twiners and creepers and so on. So if we can harvest from the land, we can slowly phase out these dense exotic invasions. And with every plant, you have to do this turnaround question. So if you say lantana is the worst invasive in this biome, the question would be, is this absolutely true? And then you might get somebody who says, but I am the worst invasive because I'm a human being and I've driven a car and I've flown here and I have a Mac laptop, or, the car culture is the worst invasive or chemically intensive. So without saying that you should take out lantana or not, I think you have to ask the question, what is the worst problem that you can actually address? And then with the others, whether you can interplant or phase out or, shade over, those are the things that, so as an ecologist or as a person who's interested in the transformation of the land over time, these are the kinds of questions that we are, intrigued by. Lots of educational work. Here are friends looking at a lycopod, which is an epiphytic plant growing on a tree, and here's hanging from a pot. People looking at epiphytic staghorn ferns in the botanic garden, which are just an amazing way to show you how these baskets collect these fern leaves, which form baskets. They collect fallen leaves from the canopy and form their own compost. And we have such plants here too. Lessons to farmers, all kinds of practitioners on the diversity of plants and how to look out for them. Taking children into the wilderness, be it the wilderness in the land or into the forest that is a reserve forest across, spending long periods of time alone, getting a feel for an unmediated contact with the wild. Lots of outdoor activities. This is a wonderful climb up a strangler fig. So education plays a major role in our work, immersive programs especially, where people have the chance to spend 2, 3, 4 weeks in very simple conditions and listening to the land, projects that they do. So schools that send children for longer periods are ones that we are very happy to work with. And for day visits, the Botanic Garden is open to thousands of people from North Kerala. Little studies of bird life or insect life or plants or the river. International hikes into the forest. Yeah, so I'm coming to the end of the talk, and this is a quote from a good friend who's part of the place, who says, to live in community, you need to tune in. And the whole task of ecosystem gardening, as we have explored it, and the care of the land as we have explored it, and the care of animals and wildlife, is really tuning in to the movements and the lives of these beings. So I think but who's Noah really? I'm not thinking of a white bearded man, in case you thought that. Is it a human? Is Noah a human? Is it a single being? Could it be the great mycorrhizal underground? Is it something elemental, the seasons? So all these, who is the driver of your particular project, is the question that we need to engage with. Okay, so that's the end of the talk.
Thank you so much, Supi. That was every bit as special as I hoped it would be, and really a fitting finale to this series of talks. But thank you so much. That was really very, very, very good. Um, Shwetal, will you handle the questions and in the way that you normally do?
Yeah. Thank you, Suprabha ma'am, and it was quite informative and really a different talk at the end where we saw a botanical garden which actually is trying to mimic. While we continue this talk, I request everyone to put their questions in the chat box, and I'll take them one by one. While the questions are coming up. I would request Vijay Asur to take up her question. The first question from Vijay Asur.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Madam, I just want to ask one question about Western Ghats. Now, an underground neutrino observatory is going to come in Western Ghats near Idiki border, which is 1200 meters below the ground level. They are going to dig out, blast the mountain and going to build a neutrino observatory. So what is the impact of this to the ecosystem of Western Ghats?
So 93%, from what I understand, anyway, it's a very high number. Over 90% of the Western Ghats have already been converted from natural habitat and biomes to either industrial scale agriculture. So the transformation Holocaust has actually already happened as far as the Western Ghats are concerned. It's massively converted. The climate has changed. The monsoon is now several weeks late. There's strange rains in the middle of December or January. There's a strange dry period in the middle of the monsoon where the plants are getting into it. They think the monsoon is here, and then suddenly it dries up, and all these tuberous plants they actually suffer, and they will wither and they'll die. So the neutrino observatory is I'm not observatory, whatever it is coming at the end when actually a lot has already gone, but we cannot allow it to happen. So that would be my take on that. Any such large industrial project in such a fragile area is not on.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, I myself have a question. And when we when we have a piece of land such, and you try to make it into a botanical garden, the right way in which you have approached, what are the different type of I won't say them threats, but like when we have forest fires, or what are the natural factors that sometimes may affect the development of such gardens? If you can talk a little about that.
Well, the whole thing of seasons shifting, I think everybody has been commenting on it, because that affects, for instance, flowering and seed set, and then of fruit formation and germination. So the phenology of these rainforest trees and epiphyte, everything actually is profoundly affected by 8 months of cloud cover and rainfall. So that to me is like the big threat, over and above fragmentation. So you need to have how are you going to create the climate for this particular piece of land? And the climate is the biggest problem for us.
Okay, So can we think of having any like typically the nurseries have a green net or a net shed area. So maybe something with solar energy or something which controls the climate in certain pockets till the time the plants are acclimatized or brought to a level. Maybe that could be a thought. What do you think about it?
So see, since we're working with rainforest plants, it's relatively easy for us to grow these various rainforest plants from around the world. But I would really not encourage it at all. If you could have a water heavy system in some place and create a botanic garden that requires water and greenhouses and thermostat controlled operations and things that blow air and all that. But why do we want to go towards technology when actually there's tremendous possibilities with very little, and there's actually really little technology that we use? So I would encourage exploring the climate of that particular place and slowly working with it. That's what I have seen of all the people here. They work with the
Okay.
existing, yeah.
So
So shade netting is fine. Shade netting is great, but what are you going to do with it? Once it disintegrates, and then there's all this plastic microfiber floating all over the place, or entering the waters and so on. So those are questions that are being asked in the place. What is the
Right.
the flip side of some of the materials that we use?
Okay. Okay. Yeah. Thank you so much. I would request Soham to take up the question.
Good evening, Suprabha. Thank you for an absolutely captivating talk. My question was, and me coming from a slightly more ecological background, when you start reforesting a piece of forest and you introduce sort of every level of plant growth from epiphytic to trees, have you noticed a time period that reforested patch takes to start behaving in a self-regenerative manner, or what we would say, quote unquote, a natural forest?
So there's this cardamom place that I mentioned. That's pretty independent now, and it's about 23, 24 years old, where it was quite open, and now it's really closed and high diversity, and there's an occasional sort of weeding operation or something, and it borders this natural forest. So there's a tremendous movement of animals and seed source and wind and everything. So that is the place to really ask the question, where does the garden end and where does the forest begin? Because it's very close to it. And the list of plants that I provided in the talk was actually, Lali and I worked it out, like what are the plants of this area that do well in this place? And they're all in that area, which is the older part of the place. So 15 to 20 years, you start to see these epiphytic plants come in on their own in an area that had been completely ravaged.
Thanks. Yeah.
Okay. May I request Faisal to ask his question, please?
Yeah, sure. Suprabha, I wanted to ask if your group is working on any other lands, or with the FD, have other landholders around or possibly up and down elsewhere in the Western Ghats requested you to help them restore their land?
Over the years, we've had lots of requests. And the place is open to the public, so people come and they have an acre of land somewhere and they want to rewild it, or they want to farm in a way that is encouraging wildlife and native biodiversity. So that is an ongoing thing. Or the forest department comes and wants to set up a furnarium. The thing that we are doing, which is quite new, is for the last several years, about 4 years now, the small farmers and indigenous people of this area, the Panya people and the Kurcha people. So we have this operation that's about 16 kilometers long, protecting the Porambok areas of the little stream that I showed you. And then talking to people about changing practices on the hill slopes that come down into the stream, monitoring the forest, which is a state forest reserve. So that is state reserve forest. So that's working with the forest department. And all these lot of fly tipping happens, so the trawling of the stream for plastic and chemical bottles and dish antenna, people just come and use it as a dump. So that is something that I think is really exciting, where local people are taking up different kinds of projects, from tree planting to river cleaning, monitoring wildlife. So that to me is actually the way to go. Further afield with Vasant, there's been a lot of work done in the Nilgiris. Actually, Vasant's work came after a study that we had done in 2001 and 2 for the Forest Department on the Mukurti National Park. And then Vasant's whole study, took that to an entirely different level. In Coorg, we've done a lot of consultations with people who have plantations. And then there are schools that visit, residential schools that have land that, take back ideas, and children take up ideas and so on. So over the years, there's been a lot of back and forth with many, many different groups of people.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, we can take Theun's question.
Hi, Supi. Thank you.
Hey.
A question. How do you regenerate these water cycles? How big an issue is it? And do you also look at nutrient cycles?
So each of the gardeners has would have a different take on that, because someone who's working on a rock slope or on a grassland will have different nutrient requirements, and also the balance between sun and shade and exposure to the rain and so on. It's completely different if you're in a sheltered forest and if you're in an open slope, completely different, or if you're on the edge. The place is rainforest. The nutrients are actually not in the ground. It's very nutrient poor, the soil, right? That we all know that, and it's all in the leaf litter, and it's more than 70% or 80% of the nutrition or the nutrients are in the living biomass. So there's rapid cycling of nutrients. So the land is generating now, because of these invasive areas which we are slowly pushing back. There's actually a lot of biomass that is available on the land, trails that we can sweep up, compost heaps that we can build up, and scatter this mulch all over the place. So again, you'd have to talk to the different gardeners about how they use this material. And the water cycle is pretty obvious that as in this climate, as it becomes more forested, and I would say that this whole land wants to go towards trees. So the grassland habitat of the rockery, they are artificial, and they have to be kept to that. They have to be pruned and weeded and so on. But there are springs coming out of this land. And I know that springs in the area have dried up in further, and it was only in the last 2 monsoons, when the Kerala floods and the big rains happened, that those springs have regenerated because of that intensity of rainfall. But there's been these perennial springs coming out of the land, which is also coming to this abundance of a tree-based biome.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. May I request Kushal to take his question?
Hi. Thank you so much, ma'am. It was very helpful to understand this part of the geography again after Vasant's talk. I think you already answered my first question about soil remediation through the mulching and the composting, which you mentioned. I also had a second question. I think so much of good work has been done by you over the last 50 years almost to make this place like it is right now. In terms of policy level with the forest department, like, do you get any assistance to protect it now? Because like what Pradeep sir mentioned in the beginning about the Andaman example, or what's happening in Goa right now, like what if tomorrow someone decides to make a helipad here, and they would want to do a compensation planting in Jammu for this. So in terms of protection, is there some kind of like a positive optimism or vibes with the forest department that they see it as an important benchmark now?
There's definitely more attention from the forest department, more positive attention in the last, say, 5 to 10 years than in the past, when this was just considered to be a harebrained exercise where people are growing interesting but useless plants, because there's no commercial activity that based out of the plants here. But recently, and particularly this whole Kerala floods, and it's very clear that many of the forested areas of the I'll say that with a little qualifier, that it's not true that all natural habitat are more resilient. It is true, though, that there is a certain diversity in the place which has kept it protected. So people want to find out, how to manage landslips, or what will take us through the next flood, and so on. So there's a lot of interest that has happened in the last 2-3 years because of the Kerala floods. And there's this whole thing that's happening, which is called coffee something Wayanad. And they want to bring back shade coffee and keep the native trees, and talk about carbon sequestration, carbon neutral, all those sorts of things. So those sorts of people are coming to us, and we're just saying, why have coffee in the first place? Let's sacrifice a beverage and have the forest. And why not have the forest as something that you can encourage towards an income generation, or ecosystem gardening for livelihoods. And because the people of this land, and particularly the Western Ghats and particularly Kerala, there's such an ability with tubers and climbers and trees and monocots and dicots, and they just have this tremendous skill base. So, and you want to sacrifice that and have a coffee garden and have a kiosk and sell this. So why not have these diverse homesteads with medicinal plants and native trees and wildlife coming through? And that should be what we are, using for livelihood generation. But there is no protection at the level that you're talking about, because there was a dam projected for this area some 15-20 years ago. There was a lot of protest, and then because there are very few Adivasis in this area, I think, and a lot of settler migrant people, the dam didn't come through, because tea gardens were the things that they were saying, it'll submerge our tea gardens. There's a railway line that's projected for the area, so there's a lot of pressure. I'm not at all convinced that the future is some safe place.
Yeah, I hope the benchmark stays. So, congratulations. Thank you so much.
Yeah, well, that has to go to the whole group of amazing gardeners that who live here.
For sure.
Thank you. Abhinaya, we can take your question now.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, Suprabha. It's a very beautiful presentation of such an amazing place. I just wanted to know, because you mentioned that almost 90% of the Western Ghats is almost gone, like the natural forest of the rainforest. So in the long run, how do you think one can augment the kind of revival work that you're doing, and how can it become a large scale movement, if I can call it that?
I mean, that's the hardest question. I mean, if somebody had the answer, I think it would have happened. And I think Pradeep has pitched this context. It's critical that any corridors, or protection of old growth areas, and then reviving of lands towards biodiversity, protection of watersheds, water bodies, it's just huge work, and there's plenty of work cut out for all of us. I mean, the entire humankind can be employed in, in creating the biosphere, and that should be the first action right now. Because I know do we have a future without a living planet? But there are trends, and you don't know how long they're going to last, and whether it's the organic movement or permaculture, or the sense of a biodiverse area through tourism and so on. Everything counts, because every toehold of life, there's a possibility for more life. And so I remain optimistic that that life itself will push forward the possibility for itself, but we really have to stop the infrastructure projects. That is of absolute necessity. The large scale infrastructure projects which are devouring the mountains, And the mountains support 240 million people. All the rivers that come out of these mountains are supported by these forests, by these little mosses. Epiphytes generate something like 1/3 of the hydrological cycle of the rainforest. So epiphytes, mosses. So who is doing moss conservation so that you can have a river, so that you can have people down there, So there's a lot of work.
Okay, thank you.
Oh,
I think we should have container parks where the Western Ghats are. Just convert the whole thing into container parks, cargo terminals. Let the human race die out. Probably the best thing for the planet, don't you think? If we became extinct. No,
Yeah.
it's very worrying, Supi. I mean, the government of India, as it's constituted at the moment, has made all these commitments to the Bonn Convention about restoring 30 million hectares of degraded forest land. It's alarming to think that a few weeks ago they've claimed they've already done 9 million hectares. Where, with whom, with what species, in what biome, nobody knows. It's just, but the conversion of the Andaman Islands to a cargo terminal with an ambition to become like Singapore, to me is perhaps the most eloquent description of how this government thinks and what their values are and what they believe to be right and wrong, And it really does need to be now opposed tooth and nail by everyone. It's very, very alarming.
Yeah.
Okay, anybody else has a question?
I guess Faisal has a question.
Yeah, Suprabha, I was just curious. You said you're not a gardener. So what's your role? What do you see as your role in the sanctuary, and what do you get up to?
I do a lot of documentation. I kind of track stories of people in the landscape as well as the gardeners here. I've observed the place over a very long period of time. I teach what I know, which is kind of a version of what we've just had. I've also set up many of the projects. So the Green Phoenix, which I didn't talk about except at the end, was this community-based ecological nurturance. I'm very involved with that. And then Vasant and me and some others, we've also bought some land in the Nilgiris, and that there will be a whole effort towards this rewilding of this land, which will include also camps with people and so on. So I sort of have many hats that I put on and a few real skills, but the place also needs a generalist, and lots of people come. Needs money, needs support of different kinds. And I'm fundamentally, I guess, interested in ecology and ask these questions and direct people's attention towards pressing issues. And then obviously, there's also plenty of work to counter various things that are happening. So there's this, full spectrum sort of thing that I have seemed to have adopted. And I came out of an interest in the forest itself, but then ended up doing all these very many different things.
I think I'm going to add to that, Supi. I think that one of one of her biggest hats is a teacher hat. I've seen her functioning as a teacher with little children and with middle-sized children and with grown-ups. And it's just amazing to see how effective she is and how much she gets through to people of all kinds and people of all ages. She ran a program was it for 4 years, Supi, or landscapes and life skills, where for 8 months she had small groups of people who lived on the land and imbibed all sorts of things, and then traveled with her from Kerala to central India to the Himalaya. So Supi is a very, very special kind of teacher and an inspirer. And that's how I would describe her, I think.
Yeah, perhaps Pradeep, very much in the oral tradition. And I think, there's a lot of I've seen several of fellow educators are here today. And it's been, building community is what we have done, and then passing on that which we have understood and worked with, and we have, pass that on to anybody, any bakra who comes our way, can learn about epiphytes and rivers and the problems around them, and human relationships within the landscape and so on. So I'm definitely part of a tribe of amazing people.
And I'll add one more thing, Supi, and that is the generosity with which you share what you know and what you love. I mean, I know people who work in very similar fields, who do the equivalent of, how people, when they were doing their exams, would put their hands like this so that nobody could see what they were writing in their exams. But I know people who think like that and function like that. And what is so lovely about you and all the people you work with is that, your openness and your generosity. And I want to compliment that.
Thank you.
Thank you. I guess it's true and applicable to all the speakers we had here. They're very, very generous, and the knowledge sharing was tremendous in the last couple of weeks what we had. Any more questions, or I can hand it over to Aditya then? I guess we've done with the questions. Yeah, so we had a lot of...
Sorry, just 1 second.
Yes, sir.
I noticed that Divya and Shankar are here, and they actually lead a whole initiative that has to do with eco-restoration. And I wonder whether they would want to just say a few words about what they do in terms of, helping people to stay in touch on this. Can we persuade you, either Divya or Sridhar, to say something about this?
Hi Pradeep, and hi Suprabha. Wonderful talk as always. And I think one of the things that is a sort of a takeaway from Suprabha's talk also is how to connect people with nature at different levels. The intricacy of it is substantial. And she showed how you can think of it at the level of a biome or a habitat or a niche, or going all the way down to a single organism, a tiny plant growing on a tree, and beginning to appreciate that and to foster that connection with the people who come to these places to visit the rainforest. That, I think, is a sort of a key challenge for all of us, is to try and make that connection, try to evoke that fascination and appreciation, because a lot of the other things come from there. Once you have that kind of a connection, or you have the beginnings of that kind of a connection, is when you can bring in these additional aspects, saying, look what we are doing to the land, to the places, and then bring a story of looking forward to what we can do going ahead. So that's really what we feel is the biggest challenge. And if we manage to do that, then I think we see that people are often on our side. In fact, restoration is an activity. In conservation, usually we identify people as being harmful and damaging and causing so much destruction. But when people are sensitized to this, we realize in restoration that we need a lot of people to get involved. We have to turn back to people. It's not an easy task. It's not something one or two people can do. It requires a lot of people working in concert. It's very labor intensive. It's very time intensive. It requires a lot of care and compassion. So doing that works well with some communities. The general people who visit, school students, people who already have an inclination towards nature. It's a little more challenging with the government authorities. And, because they come with their own mindsets and training, So you very rightly pointed out about what's happening with the afforestation, nationwide, and this whole terrible thing that's happening in the Andamans, where that comes from a completely different mindset, one that looks at land as a commodity. It's trying to exploit it economically, and the training is all geared towards that. So you have to break those barriers to get those people involved, and so that's been a big challenge.